What's up, everybody? My name is Jeremy Schumacher. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm the Jer in Wellness with Jer. Today, we're going to talk about a Superman comic story. I'm a critical fan of Superman, and really, I think this is a Batman story. It's probably why I like it so much. It's my favorite Superman story because it's sneakily a Batman story. We're going to talk about Jeff Loeb's Emperor Joker storyline. Definitely, it's my favorite Superman, not just because of Batman, but because it's very much about the Joker. Joker, I think, is one of those, like, I don't know, edgelord characters that I think a lot of people like, or like they try and make him into like the hero, and he's never ever the hero. He's one of the quintessential DC villains. I would argue like one of the best villains, up there with Darth Vader. Sorry, Darth Vader's a bad example. Darth Vader is the hero of Star Wars. Let's not forget that. In society's mind, I guess I would say. But yeah, Joker's a great character in the sense of like he's exceedingly interesting. A story that involves the Joker is almost never going to be boring. It's always going to be captivating. But like he's not somebody we should like. He's not an anti-hero. He's not like an underdog we should root for. He's not somebody who's like saying the right things. Like he's a bad guy. He's a villain in every sense of the word. He might be entertaining or charming, but like bad dude, right? So, yeah, Emperor Joker. It's a Superman story. It's set outside of Gotham. It's set kind of everywhere. As I've grown older, I've grown to dislike universal stories, so stories that like span the entire universe. It's kind of what I think the MCU has gotten in trouble with. The example I use for that is like Guardians of the Galaxy 1 was a local story. It was very much just about the Guardians of the Galaxy on this one planet. And then Guardians of the Galaxy 2, which I thought was a lot worse, was like, the entire universe will be destroyed if you don't do X, Y, and Z. And like, as much as they try and like inflate the stakes become far less interesting in a weird way. So this is a story that I read when I was younger, as a teenager. I think this is like the collected version from the library. This is like a 2006 story. I'm paging because I should know. 2007 is the collected version coming out. So odds are it came out in 2006 in actual comic book form. So it's an older story. As far as I know, and I'm not like the be-all end-all on superhero stories, it's one of the first stories that really like intrinsically linked, not first stories like it hadn't been done before, but it like came out and said out loud, very upfront, like Batman and Joker are yin and yang. Like one doesn't exist without the other. So I think that's a story. I think it's a story that has affected a lot of other Batman stories since then, even thinking in terms of like Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy with The Dark Knight, and Heath Ledger playing the Joker. Like that was very much like he was saying like he doesn't exist without Batman. They are, two sides of the same coin kind of thing. So I think this story really kind of put that as like a character trait of the Joker, as opposed to like just kind of being one of Batman's villains. It really moved Joker into like the Batman villain, in a very like blatant way, not just like it came up. I don't know. I'm not going to get into the whole Batman history. There are people who know it much better than I do. But yeah, Emperor Joker. So the story basically, I'm going to do a brief overview and then talk about the mental health topics, right? That's what I do. So the story basically is Mr. Mxyzptlk, is an imp from the fifth dimension. An imp from the fifth dimension has like nearly omnipotent powers. Like he's all powerful. He can pretty much do anything. And he gets tricked into giving the Joker 99% of his power. And so he meant to give Joker 1% of his power, and Mr. Mixie, I'm just going to call him that. That's what he's called often, but it's much easier than Mxyzptlk to say. His name is supposed to be hard to pronounce. In the Superman mythos, like he comes to bother Superman once every 30 days or something like that. And he does it basically in his own view. And he's like kind of a bad guy, but kind of I don't know, he's an imp, he's fiendish, he's naughty, but he's not like evil. He does it so that in his mind, Superman doesn't take things too seriously. So like that's a canon Mr. Mixie thing. So he was going to give Joker 1% of his power. Whoops, Joker tricked him into giving him 99% of his power, and now Joker is the emperor of everything. Like he's remade the universe in his own image. There's a scene where like you see the world is gone, like the earth is gone, and it's just a cube in the shape of like with the Joker's head on every side of the cube. So he has like that level of power. And so Superman keeps waking up in prison, some version of prison, whether it's Arkham or other things. The story kind of moves around, and Bizarro, who's like the alternate, the Bizarro Superman. I don't have a better way to describe it, but he always speaks like backwards. Everything he says is opposite. So Bizarro keeps capturing Superman. Superman can't fly. He can only leap tall buildings. Lois Lane is Lex Luthor in this storyline. All of the JLA, the Justice League of America, have been transformed. That comes up later, but it's important. Like Aquaman isn't king of the seven seas. He's afraid of water, and so he's keeping everyone out of the water. Wonder Woman, I think a really offensive take on Wonder Woman is she has like a reality baking show. The Green Lantern is like a paper lantern. So there's some stuff from this that like 2006 really didn't age well. We don't know why or how the Joker tricked Mr. Mixie. We just know he was going to give Joker 1% of his power to be an irritant to Superman, and whoops, that didn't work. And so that's the premise, right? Like that's the whole story. Is Superman has to figure out how to stop the Joker when the Joker has nearly unlimited power. And that comes up over and over again. Big characters from DC are made to look like weak and not able to do anything. Like Darkseid pops up at one point, you're like, oh, here we go, Darkseid, he's like the DC's big bad, let's see. And Joker just like turns him into a mascot. So Joker's super overpowered here again. Like 12-year-old me read this and thought it was very fascinating and interesting and an amazing story, and like 34-year-old me reads it and is like, well, there's parts of the storytelling that are kind of weak or I don't really love. But it's a fascinating look. Joker is constantly hurting people in the JLA. He's constantly remaking the universe, like over and over again. He remakes it because he keeps getting bored, and that boredom leads to him like reset everything. So at one point, he turns all of the Justice League into animals. Superman almost stops him. Joker lets him like believe that he's finally convinced Lois to be a good guy again instead of basically being female Lex Luthor, and they're going to overthrow the Joker, and then it's just an elaborate ruse for Joker's entertainment. I think this storyline was in one of the later animated Batman, the Batman exclamation point. That animated series had like a brief run of this, much less traumatic. I think it seems to be much more comical. I just saw some clips online in prepping for this video, but it was much more like humorous, like Joker using like Rube Goldberg type traps to kill Batman over and over again. But in this story, in every chapter, there's like an agonized scream from somewhere in the city, and we don't know what that is until about halfway through the story, and we find out the Joker's been killing Batman every single day in these alternate realities. Or not alternate realities, this messed up reality that the Joker's in charge of. And so he keeps killing Batman over and over again. Superman has to figure out how to save him. Mr. Mixie is in it a little bit. He's had his memory wiped, or he's forgotten how to get out of this, or he doesn't know like what the Joker's rules are, so he doesn't have any power. So that's kind of an ongoing thing. But Joker's bored. He keeps killing Batman for less and less laughs. His like inner circle is a bunch of like weird characters. Some of them were created for this story. Like I think Gorgeous Gilly at Inferno are characters who are new to the storyline and are still around. So like interesting in that perspective that like some new DC characters came out of this. But basically like Joker gets bored and he's going to keep destroying the universe. And so it gets to a point where he's like ready to destroy the universe. And I think one of the most poignant parts of the story is Harley Quinn comes up to him and is like, but you're not going to kill me, right? Like, you and I, we've been through everything. Like, I'm your queen. Like, what are we doing together? And Joker, like, can't bring himself to kill her, but he, like, casts her into the stars and makes like a constellation, a Harley shaped constellation. So he's like, you'll have the best view of Armageddon from up there. So it's like a weirdly sweet thing, but for me, as an older adult reading it now, looking back on it, like it is the epitome of an abusive relationship between Harley and Joker. And like, there's other stories that I certainly think get into this. Like Harley Quinn has had a bit of a renaissance as a character in that she stood up for herself, she set boundaries, she broke up with Joker. They're not in a relationship anymore. She came out. She's in a relationship with Poison Ivy. I'm not sure how. I think that's canon. But there's a bunch of different, there's so many different DC storylines going on. It's hard to keep track of anything. That's a popular canon in a lot of different DC trends. But so this relationship between Harley and Joker has been unhealthy for a while. Harley initially was a psychiatrist treating the Joker, falls in love with him, breaks him out, becomes Harley Quinn. She's Harleen Quinzel back in the day. So yeah, and she's like a pretty quintessential Batman character too. Like Joker and Harley kind of go hand in hand, or did for most of what I experienced Batman as a child, and then the Arkham games, which I think are pretty close to canon as people can get because of their popularity. So Harley is a big deal in all of those. So for me, like, he's really terrible to her this whole story, and he's like kind of flirty with Lois Lane, but it seems very obvious that he's just doing that to bother Superman, not that he's actually interested. But like, again, he's just like awful to Harley throughout, like hitting on Lois, making Lois the Empress instead of Harley. And so that's one of those things that really jumped out at me, is like how unhealthy this relationship is. And it's one of those things that like Joker can't be put on a pedestal. Joker can't be like the anti-hero. We can't like the Joker because he's awful all the time. Like, yes, he's threatening to kill the universe. And that's one of those things where it's like, I think when the stakes get so inflated, they become almost less important, because like this story, we can see how sad Harley is with like the world being destroyed and her place in not being protected. Like her realizing she's not special to Joker really hurts her feelings. And like we as human beings are wired to relate to that with some empathy. And then versus like 8 billion people are going to be wiped out in a blink. Like that's horrific. But also because the stakes are so high, like cognitive biases, we can't process a number that large. Like human beings can't realistically process like 10,000. Like we can't put that into a frame of reference. Like we have some cheats around it where we can be like, oh, a basketball stadium holds 20,000 people, a football stadium holds 70,000 people. But then we're also like, traffic's so bad. How come this is like, because we can't process in a realistic way 70,000 people. Side note, anyway, but like again, when we think of like these huge kind of genocidal type things, the entire world being destroyed, it's really hard to like, I don't want to say care, but like it's, our empathy gets triggered a lot more in a small local story like Harley and Joker's relationship versus the entire planet or the entire universe is going to be destroyed. So I thought that was one of the really like interesting parts of the story, is just how like terrible Joker is to Harley. And it's really highlighted by like this sweet moment, and he's still not giving her what she wants or asks for. He's still being awful to her. He still kills her. He just does it in like a seemingly sweet way, because in his mind, like that's what sweetness is. So really interesting, I think, from that perspective, like Joker's awful. One of the other things that on rereading as like a trained therapist now, as opposed to like reading it as a kid or a teenager, probably preteen when I was reading this for the first time, Joker's like insanity is always a little wonky. Like in this story, he's kind of kooky. He's quirky. He's making jokes to get laughs, and like he's breaking the fourth wall to like comment on how some of his jokes are pretty lame. But like he's a homicidal maniac. He's insane in the sense of like a psychopath doesn't care about other people, and so he keeps ruining everybody's lives. But like insane question mark, I don't know. Like I've worked with people who have breaks with reality. I've worked with paranoid schizophrenics. I work with people who dissociate. I work with people who have bipolar, and when they're manic, like those breaks with reality are like, nah, you're not operating in the same like realm as the rest of us. Like your brain is on a totally different wavelength. So like experiencing different reality, that true break with reality, insanity type thing is never really in Joker's stories. It's why it's one of those like, I think he's one of those fascinating characters, because he's almost depending on the storyline, impossible to diagnose. Like, is he criminally insane? Sure, but like that's not a realistic defense very often. People will often put a lighter defense in instead of insanity and say like, circumstances surrounding an event may have led someone to lose a rational, an otherwise rational person to lose control. I forget the legal term for it. But defense of insanity is rarely used, and it's rarely successful, especially in the United States. So it's one of those things where like I think comic book trope has like criminal insanity as a thing, but as far as like what's his actual diagnosis, like even like diagnosing something like sociopath or psychopath, like it's not a real diagnosis. It's a category of people who don't have empathy. It's a category of people who are, something in their brain is either turned off or is missing or is so damaged that they can't think of other people. But like it's not a DSM diagnostics, the diagnostic and statistical manual that therapists use. It's not a diagnosis. He doesn't have a good diagnosis in there. I don't diagnose personality disorders. That's the whole thing. I usually say trauma. We don't know the Joker's history. That's why I think he's one of those fascinating characters. Like you have Alan Moore's famous story of The Killing Joke, where he's a failed magician or comedian, and he falls into that vat of acid, and like that's kind of the classic Joker origin story. But like again, that's not canon. I think that was DC Black Label, or whatever they called it back in '86 or whenever it was written. And that's a good backstory, and it happens in different places. But like Batman Mask of the Phantasm, like Joker's a goon. He's like a crime boss who turns into something else. Excuse me. The Christopher Nolan series, the Joker Heath Ledger plays, gives a bunch of different backgrounds for himself, and they're all like trauma based. But again, we don't know really what happened. In the Joaquin Phoenix Joker film, he's traumatized. He's got an abusive relationship. He's emotionally stunted. He's got an abusive relationship with his mom. He has a clear break with reality in that movie. Some of that movie's tough to tell because he's a very unreliable narrator, so we're not sure what actually happened versus what happened in reality. But again, like that's implying he has a break with reality. So yeah, Joker's kind of this almost amorphous character in sense of like what's wrong with him and what's the diagnosis for him. In this story, the whole thing kind of hinges on the fact that Joker keeps remaking the universe, but he can't make one without Batman. And so the end, I still enjoy the end of the story. It's fun in a way. Joker gets very offended that Superman keeps bringing up "Don't think of pink elephants" because Joker is mad that that is not a joke. It's a mnemonic device, it's wordplay, it's semantics, but it's definitely not a joke, and it's never been funny. And so his pink elephant is Batman. The idea being that when you tell someone "don't think of pink elephants," they automatically have to think of pink elephants. They weren't thinking of it before, but they are now. It's one of the reasons I talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, thought stopping. That's a technique within cognitive behavioral therapy. It doesn't work. Like, don't think a thought can't work. I'm not crazy about cognitive behavioral therapy for a lot of reasons. For most of my career, it's been the cat's meow for insurance companies because insurance companies are terribly behind the times and not very good at their jobs. Definitely not good at mental health, but they usually will reimburse for CBT. So CBT is taught a lot to a lot of people because you can get reimbursed for it, but it doesn't work that well. Tiny soapbox here. But hey, we're talking about mental health, so that's a real world mental health topic. So anyway, don't think pink elephants is the joke. And so Joker gets mad about it. Like at one point he makes a universe that doesn't have the color white in it because he's mad about the elephant joke. And so it's this idea that he can't not think of Batman. And so going back to what Mr. Mixie says earlier in the story, that there are still rules, even though the Joker's insane, which like, again, insane, like comic book insane. We don't actually have like a clear diagnosis for Joker. He's a character that's so broken you can't diagnose him, ? I don't know. He's just supposed to be a bad guy. And like again, I think that concept is fascinating. Like I will probably at some point do a video on Heath Ledger's Joker. I'll probably do a video on Joaquin Phoenix Joker. I'll probably do when I was going to teach my superhero psych class, I was doing one of the textbooks. One of the course materials I was going to make the students get is Grant Morrison's story, Arkham Asylum, Serious House on a Serious Earth. Like that story is very much about the Joker and like insanity. A lot of stuff around like Arkham has a lot to do with insanity. Arkham being a nod back to H.P. Lovecraft. So a lot about like insanity and the mind breaking. So there's a lot of good Joker stories out there, even just the comic titled Joker. War of Jokes and Riddles from Tom King's run on Batman is really good. So like Joker as a character study, I think is very fascinating. I think he's always interesting. I don't think this is the most interesting version of Joker. I think this is kind of like a kooky, humorous Joker, not like the dark and like demented type of Joker. Even though he's gonna like destroy the whole universe. Again, it's weird. I struggle with those stories in the sense of the depth of when they make the stakes so high that I have a hard time investing. But basically, Superman figures out Joker's rules are he can't create a universe without Batman. That's what helps Mr. Mixie get his power back. They put the universe back together, and then another mental health concept. Y'all know where I'm going because I haven't talked about it yet. Trauma. Batman, they put the universe back together and Batman can't close his eyes. Like he's shaking, he's shivering, he's rocking back and forth. He can't close his eyes because every time he closes his eyes, he sees one of the ways the Joker killed him. And like, they're horrific, right? Like at one point, Batman has to dig himself out of his own grave only to be like, eaten by zombies. Batman gets eaten by vultures. He has his mouth wired shut. He's created without a mouth. Like he's forced to watch Superman kill Lois Lane. All this like horrific stuff. Like it's a messed up story. As much as I want to say like Joker's kooky, like he does a lot of awful things in it. It's just always kind of framed in that like silly Joker instead of like, ooh, this makes me uncomfortable kind of Joker. So Batman has all this trauma and like he really dies in the story, but then he's brought back to life every day. So what is that? I mean, that's not realistic, right? That's not based in reality. There's no way to really talk about the psychology of that because it's not a real event. But the idea that like faced with near-death experience or your brain being convinced that it is going to die is what triggers trauma, or at least potentially a trauma response for people, is that that idea of your safety is so at risk that your brain has to go into fight or flight mode. Or freeze or fawn. Fight or flight just rolls off the tongue so easily, and then you have to add freeze or fawn. So Batman has like very clear PTSD. He's not at all functional. Can't close his eyes. Won't be able to sleep. He's not able to like, get up. Like it's him and Spectre, who's kind of like otherworldly, all universal power type, like making sure nobody's breaking too big of rules in the universe. So he's overseeing some of this stuff earlier in the story. Like Joker's like, yeah, you don't have power over me. So he's an important character in the story, but if you don't know who Spectre is, that's fine. So it's Spectre, Superman, Mr. Mixie, and Batman. Superman threatens Mr. Mixie. Mr. Mixie says his name backwards. He goes back to the fifth dimension because that's how it works normally. That's how it's supposed to work. And Superman and Batman are talking. And like Batman can't even hear Superman. He's just like shaking, rocking back and forth. And so Spectre's basically like he's seen death too many times, like trauma. His brain snaps, like he has a break with reality. He will not be able to recover from this. And so a little bit of a cop-out. But like again, trauma, like for the people who experience complex PTSD to a point where they are not functional, which is a small percentage of the population, but it does happen. You think of people who were maybe institutionalized after World War I or World War II, kind of those classic rocking motions. Like so, it's that level of trauma, not what I talk about everybody having or most people experiencing at some point in their life. This is like a very extreme example of it. But again, like totally dysfunctional, not able to do anything. A little bit of a comic cop-out. Spectre just kind of like snaps his finger and gives all that trauma to Superman, but Superman then goes and processes it in a healthy way. Like he goes and snatches Lois as Superman out of the Daily Planet's newsroom, And she's like, what if someone saw? And he's like, it doesn't matter. I just needed to see you. So like Superman has all of his trauma from Batman, but he's going to process it by being around the people he loves. He's going to process it by doing things that are good and healthy for his brain. He's going to process it by doing the things that he thinks are important in a way that he feels are safe. So like healing trauma is getting to a point where your brain feels safe. It's getting to a point where like you can have some self-compassion for yourself so that you can process the traumatic events in a safer, healthier way. So you have to create that safety, and good support people are really important in that process. So like I liked that. Obviously, that's me reading the subtext of the story. Like those are plot points that happen, but like not at that depth. So I'm just kind of talking about it because I think like it's interesting in the sense of like, yes, trauma can get that bad for people. It's unusual that people will have a trauma response that's so extreme that they're dysfunctional across the board, but it does happen. And so that part is interesting, but then how Superman's going to process it, not like in comparison to Batman, but then we cut later and like all the empaths and psychics and all this stuff, which is like a little bit of an eye roll, right? I don't ascribe to any of those things, but all these people have had horrific nightmares, and so Batman's like suspicious that something's been going on, and Superman is with him, and they're in Metropolis instead of Gotham. They're in Metropolis where Joker is locked up, and Joker is seen on the floor rocking back and forth, and he's saying Emperor Joker backwards over and over again, in this same way that Mr. Mixie will say his name backwards to return things the way they were. That's what Joker's trying to do to return himself back to power, but he clearly has also had that break with reality. So it's kind of interesting, like in the story, everybody's memory is wiped and they put the universe back together, and yet Joker is retaining like a bit of, he remembers that he was in charge of everything and he wants to go back to that. So I said it's my favorite Superman story because it's a Batman story. It's really a Joker story. There are parts of it that I really like. There are parts of it that I think are really well written. Do I think it holds up to like maybe some current runs or some of the all-time great runs on Batman or some of the best Joker stories? No, but it's a very personal one for me because I read it when I was young and I really liked it, and it stuck out for me in a lot of ways. To see at that time, like it seemed very dark for like how dark the story got with killing Batman every day, and then the trauma before I knew any of the psychology principles behind it. I don't know that it super holds up great now, but I think like if you've never read it, it's a fun little romp. Some of the Joker as like that kooky humorous guy is funny. Some of it's very off-putting. Some of it's kind of dark and macabre, but it's a good mix of like emotional stuff. The good guys win, which is what a lot of people like in comics. Not always my favorite thing, but definitely with like Batman, Superman, that's what always needs to happen, right? Like the good guys have to win in those stories. So yeah, definitely interesting. I think check it out if you haven't. I found it at my local library. Shout out to the Milwaukee County Federated Library System, which is awesome. You know, Milwaukee gets a bad rap for a lot of things, but our zoo's pretty great. Our library system's fantastic. So it was at the library, but I think it was a big enough run and a big enough story where like it's probably still out there. I'm sure it's on Amazon and eBay and stuff like that. So not like a huge collector's edition. Very few people have written about it or reviewed it. It's kind of old, so to find reviews on the internet. This is me not having a YouTube channel to get a bunch of clicks and get YouTube famous, because I would pick a much more popular Joker story. But I think has a lot of kind of the classic things that the Joker brings to the table with mental health. I think there's kind of the commentary on trauma. There's kind of the commentary on abusive relationships. So some stuff in it that definitely I wanted to talk about, and definitely for me it was a important comic in my life, in that I read it pretty early. It was one of the more dark or serious topics that I had ever come across as a comic book. So definitely that move from like 1980s Batman and the Silver Age to more modern, darker superhero stories. So yeah, if you haven't read it, check it out. I think it's at least worth a read, if nothing else. And thanks for stopping by my channel. Peace.